Most people believe they live freely. They believe they choose their career, their opinions, their desires, and even their fears. But if you observe with a little more honesty, you will realize that a good part of these choices were not born within you. They were shaped by the expectations of others, by the silent pressure to belong, by the almost desperate need not to be seen as different. And it is precisely here that Nietzsche enters like a blow to the table, asking something that many avoid facing. To what extent are you really you? And to what extent are you just a docile piece repeating what you were taught to repeat? When Nietzsche looks at human behavior, especially this impulse to follow the majority, he sees something brutal, the tendency to live as part of a herd. This is not an insult. It is a diagnosis. The herd does not think for itself, does not question why it follows, does not define its own pace. It simply follows the pace beside it, ignoring the possibility of an individual path. And the most unsettling thing is that this does not happen because someone directly forces it, but because it is comfortable. It is easy to be just another one. It is easy to let others decide in place of one's own courage. It is easy to forget that there is an inner will that, when silenced for too long, shrinks until it disappears. But why does this happen? Why does someone born with the potential to create, transform, take risks, and assert their own life end up accepting to live as a copy? Nietzsche answers with uncomfortable clarity. Fear. A fear so deep that many don't even realize it's at work. The fear of being rejected. The fear of being judged. The fear of standing out. The fear of taking responsibility, of facing consequences, and of having no one to blame when the choices are truly their own. Fear hides behind phrases like, "Everyone thinks that way. It's the right thing to do. Better not to complicate things." But none of them reveal the essential truth. Many people prefer to give up their freedom rather than face the loneliness that comes with an authentic life. Nietzsche would call this voluntary slavery, and the term couldn't be more accurate. There are no visible chains, no shackles on the arms, no one wielding whips. There is only the habit of obeying external expectations and the inability to bear the strain of thinking for oneself. It is a comfortable, silent, and almost invisible prison. Most enter it smiling. Most never try to leave. But those who perceive the bars, those are the ones who begin to feel the restlessness that Nietzsche considered the first step toward transforming themselves. Imagine for a moment all the things you failed to say, do, or try, simply because you feared the reaction of others. Imagine each choice shaped not by what you truly desired, but by what you hoped would please someone else. Imagine how many times you followed the most predictable path, not because you believed in it, but because society had already paved that route, and you lacked the energy or courage to chart your own. Now imagine Nietzsche observing this. What would he say? He wouldn't offer consolation. He wouldn't say it's okay, that it's normal, that everyone does it. On the contrary, he would affirm, without hesitation, that living this way is wasting the most precious thing that exists, your own potential. And this is where the tension begins to rise. Because while Nietzsche denounces this condition of submission to the collective, he presents a powerful counterpoint: the will to power. Not the will to dominate other people, as is often confused, but the will to dominate oneself. The inner energy that drives someone to become stronger, more conscious, more responsible, and more true to who they really are. The will to power is the engine that awakens the individual from torpor and pulls them away from emotional dependence on the herd. But this force only begins to act when the person admits to themselves an uncomfortable truth. They are living on autopilot. And here comes the question that acts like a sharp mirror. When was the last time you made a decision that truly came from you, without the influence of fear, the opinions of others, or the need to be accepted? This question is not rhetorical. It is an invitation and, at the same time, a threat, because answering it requires courage. It requires looking at your own behavior and realizing that much of what you consider normal may simply be the unconscious adoption of values that are not your own. It requires confronting this tension between who you are and who you have learned to be in order to survive socially. Nietzsche believed that only when the individual confronts this tension, when they feel the friction between the instinct to please and the instinct to assert their uniqueness, does the true process of liberation begin. There is no light at the beginning of this path. There is only uncertainty. There is only silence. There is only a discomfort that seems almost physical, as if each step required breaking through layers of invisible conditioning. But it is precisely on this unstable ground that autonomy is born. Not before, never before. And as this reflection deepens, another question naturally arises. If the life you lead today wasn't built by your deepest desires, then whose life is it? And more importantly, how long do you intend to carry it? The answer to this isn't readily available, and that's precisely why the next part becomes essential. Because only after understanding the weight of this voluntary enslavement and feeling its consequences from within, can we delve into the true psychology of power, according to Nietzsche, and understand how the will to power transforms into direction, action, and real freedom. There's a moment in almost everyone's life when they realize, even if only for a second, that they're living according to expectations that aren't their own. It's that strange, silent feeling that appears when you're on your way to a job you dislike, repeating a routine you didn't choose, responding with an automatic smile to questions that mean nothing. It's as if, deep down, something inside you asks, why does this continue like this? When did I accept this version of life as if it were the only possible one? Most people ignore this question. Most people push it inside, like someone quickly closing a drawer to hide something uncomfortable. But Nietzsche believed that this moment is a turning point, a crack in the surface of the herd, an opportunity to see what has always been there, but for emotional convenience you preferred not to see. Perhaps you've already experienced a situation like this without giving it importance. A simple dinner with friends, where everyone shares the same opinion, and you, despite disagreeing, remain silent so as not to be the odd one out at the table. A relationship where you hide parts of your personality to avoid arguments. A career decision made not out of genuine desire, but to avoid disappointing someone. These are seemingly small details, but which, added together, shape an entire life of compromises disguised as harmony. Nietzsche would say that in these moments you are not living, you are adapting. And constant adaptation is not synonymous with intelligence. It is a sign that the will to power has been stifled by layers and layers of fear. Imagine a person walking down the street. They pass a shop window and see their reflection. But something about the image seems strange, as if the body were theirs. But the posture, the gaze, and the way of breathing belong to someone else. This kind of sensation happens in the mind before it happens in the mirror. It's that feeling that you are present but not whole, that something is out of place within yourself. Many feel this, but few admit it. Even fewer decide to investigate, because investigating means giving up the psychic protection of the herd and taking the risk of discovering that part of your life was built on fragile foundations. Nietzsche saw the modern world as a space full of people who wear masks so well fitted that they end up confusing the masks with their own faces. And the most curious thing is that while these people are afraid to reveal their imperfections, they secretly wish someone would truly see them. They want to be recognized not for what they appear to be, but for who they really are. But this honesty comes at a price: vulnerability. It demands that you stop repeating ready-made phrases, that you reconsider comfortable beliefs, and that you admit that perhaps you have lived in a way that is distant from your essence. This is a price that almost no one wants to pay. But there is a particular moment when this denial begins to crumble. When a person realizes that no matter how much they follow all the unwritten rules of collective behavior, no matter how much they try to please, conform, and be normal, they still cannot find the feeling of fulfillment they imagined. It's like completing all the steps of an invisible manual and, in the end, discovering that there is no real reward. This silent void, which many try to fill with distractions, consumption, fleeting relationships, or superficial goals, is exactly the kind of experience that Nietzsche saw as a sign that the will to power is knocking at the door, asking to be heard. And it is at this point that the narrative takes on a more unexpected tone, because unlike what many believe, Nietzsche does not see the herd as an external prison, imposed by gigantic social forces. He sees the herd within each individual. It is not the world that imprisons you. It is the part of you that fears its own freedom, the part that prefers the approval of the group to the restlessness of following its own path, the part that chooses the comfort of the known, even when the known suffocates. This revelation is uncomfortable because it shifts responsibility. There is no external culprit. There is no social, political, or cultural villain to point the finger at. There is only you facing yourself. And yet there is something liberating in that. Because if the prison is internal, so is the key. Nietzsche believed that when someone realizes they don't depend on external validation to exist, a new kind of strength is born. Not an aggressive strength, but a serene strength. A silent confidence that dispenses with explanations, justifications, and requests for permission. A strength that doesn't need to announce its existence because it expresses itself naturally, in the way one acts, speaks, and walks through the world. This strength is nothing more than the will to power emerging from a dormant state. But before this awakening happens, there is an inevitable conflict. It's as if the individual is divided in two directions. One part wants to continue following the predictable flow of the herd. The other wants to break with this route and take the risk of becoming someone authentic. This conflict doesn't happen in a grand way. It arises in the details, in the moment when you are about to say something true, but hesitate, in the instant when you think about changing something important but freeze, in the choice to remain where you are for fear of losing the approval of those around you. Each hesitation is a reminder that the struggle is not against the world, but against one's own fragmented will. And here enters an almost paradoxical element. Nietzsche did not believe that the truth about oneself is revealed in moments of calm, but in moments of friction. It is in tension that authenticity appears. It is in discomfort that one's true nature manifests itself. It is when you are about to repeat an automatic behavior, and for a brief instant, you feel the urge to act differently. That instant, so small that many don't even notice it, is the beginning of the inner rebirth that Nietzsche describes. It's not a flash, it's a spark. But if you ignore it, it goes out. If you pay attention, it grows. Perhaps you've already experienced this spark without realizing it. A thought that arose out of nowhere. What if I did things differently? A sudden urge to say no where you've always said yes. A restlessness that no longer fits within the same circumstances. These small ruptures are signs that the will to power is trying to emerge, even under the weight of social conditioning. And it is precisely on this border, between conditioning and autonomy, that the psychology of power begins to manifest itself. Part 3 will delve into exactly this point, how this inner will transforms into concrete force, and why Nietzsche believed that only those who overcome this conflict can truly become masters of themselves. The will to power, in its deepest sense, is not a desire for victory over others, but a desire for victory over that within you which tries to diminish you. Nietzsche understood this force as a natural impulse of life, something as essential as breathing, but which most learn to silence from an early age. And the curious thing is that this force doesn't appear in a grand way at the beginning. It manifests itself as a kind of inner unease, as a dissatisfaction that cannot be rationally explained. It's that feeling that you were born for something greater than the life you live, but you still don't know what it is, nor how to find it. The modern world tries to fill this discomfort with noise. It offers distractions, ready-made certainties, pre-chewed opinions. Every day you are invited to look outward and not inward. But it is precisely when all these distractions fall silent, even if only for a few seconds. At the end of the night, in a random interval, or in a conversation that catches you off guard, that the will to power tries to assert itself. It emerges as a reminder that there is something in you that does not conform, something that refuses to be just another piece fitted into a repetitive structure. It is at this moment that an uncomfortable revelation emerges. You do not fear the world. You fear becoming what you truly are. Because in embracing your own greatness, you automatically assume responsibility, and responsibility demands courage. But here arises the question that Nietzsche would leave echoing in the mind of anyone who listens attentively. Why do you continue to run away from yourself? The will to power doesn't want you to be the strongest in the room, nor the most admired, nor the most feared. It wants you to be someone capable of acting from your innermost truth. This is frightening because it demands abandoning emotional crutches. It demands knowing how to deal with your own shadow, and it demands accepting that authenticity comes with a noble solitude. Not a sad solitude, but a solitude in which you finally find yourself. Many fear this solitude because they have been trained to believe that being themselves will never be enough. But there's something even more interesting. Nietzsche believed that the will to power reveals itself most intensely in moments when you feel weakest. Paradoxical, but true. When you are knocked down by a loss, by a failure, by an unexpected rejection, it's as if the superficial layers you use to protect yourself are ripped away. What remains is your naked essence, and within it lies the strength you tried to deny. That's why some people are reborn precisely during the darkest periods of their lives. Not because pain automatically builds something good, but because it removes what masked who you really are. It is in this context that a second question arises, capable of dismantling any defense. What have you been avoiding facing because you know it would completely change your life? The will to power does not tolerate false internal narratives. It demands that you face your contradictions with clarity. Perhaps you say you want freedom, but remain trapped in emotional addictions. Perhaps you say you desire growth, but flee from the responsibilities that this growth demands. Perhaps you say you seek authenticity, but still try to please those who do not respect your intensity. The will to power is not satisfied with speeches. It demands action. And that is why Nietzsche believed it functions as an internal barometer of your honesty with yourself. And here emerges a rare, often ignored perspective. The will to power is silent. It doesn't shout. It doesn't urgently pressure you. It doesn't threaten you. It simply observes. And when you ignore it for too long, it doesn't disappear. It transforms. It can become constant irritation, anxiety, a feeling of emptiness, a loss of meaning. Not as punishment, but as signs that you are living below your own inner capacity. These signs are not symptoms of weakness. They are alarms. And the more you try to suppress them, the more intense they become. Then comes the inevitable third question. What would you do today if you completely abandoned your fear of other people's opinions? When you finally answer that question, even if only mentally, you realize there's a chasm between the life you live and the life you truly desire. And Nietzsche argued that it is precisely in this chasm that the individual discovers who they can become. Those who fear it return to the herd. Those who feel curiosity take a step forward. And those who take that step discover something that transforms everything. Freedom lies not in the final destination, but in movement. In the ability to choose one's own path with full awareness that it may be lonely, difficult, and even chaotic. But it is yours. And when this perception matures, a curious phenomenon occurs. The person who previously feared being judged begins to realize that most of the opinions that frightened them had no real depth. They were merely reflections of other people's fears. The person who previously sought approval begins to see that many of those they tried to impress don't impress themselves. The person who previously avoided conflict realizes that the greatest conflict has always been within themselves. And suddenly something changes. A different kind of calm emerges. You begin to walk with more firmness, not because everything is clear, but because now you know you are capable of walking even when the road is not illuminated. This is what Nietzsche would call the first stage of real power, the capacity to exist from oneself. There is no spectacle in this. There is no shouting. There is no audience. There is only the intimate experience of feeling that for the first time, you are acting not under external influence, but of your own free will. And it is in this transition, at this point where the individual almost hears their own internal layers reorganizing themselves, that space opens up for the next step, transforming this silent force into concrete direction. And that is what Part 4 will unveil, how the will to power ceases to be merely an internal impulse and becomes a way of acting, thinking, and building a life that finally belongs to you. When the will to power ceases to be merely a silent impulse and begins to move as action, something extraordinary happens. The person begins to experience life in a way that previously seemed inaccessible. It's as if, after years of living in the dark, someone lights an inner lantern that illuminates paths that were always there, but that you never had the courage to travel. This transformation doesn't happen linearly. It occurs in small shocks of consciousness, in unexpected moments that break the automatic state. Nietzsche believed that these ruptures are the true beginning of autonomy. And, however strange it may seem, many of these ruptures come from seemingly common situations, but which carry intense symbolic force. Imagine someone trapped in a suffocating routine, living for years in the same repetitive cycle, until one day, during a work break, they decide to walk down a different street. Simple, banal action. But in this small change, something is revealed. The person notices details they had never seen before, feels their own body differently, observes the world with a new sense of wonder. It's as if, by deviating a single step from their usual path, they have opened a crack through which the will to power can finally breathe. This sensation, however small, is so powerful that some people change the course of their entire lives because of it. A simple detour that awakens an avalanche of perceptions about how much was dormant within themselves. Stories like this abound, but they go unnoticed because they don't involve major events. However, there are also surprising cases where the will to power manifests itself almost abruptly. There's a curious study, conducted in London, about people who, after surviving serious accidents, completely changed their lives in a matter of weeks. Some left established careers to pursue fields they had always loved. Others ended relationships that had been strained for years, and others adopted more courageous and direct behaviors. The most intriguing finding of the study is that more than 60% of these people stated that they felt an inner calling, that they could no longer ignore after the experience. Nietzsche would explain this clearly. When the facade that sustains the herd breaks, the inner truth emerges like a jet of light. But we don't need accidents or profound crises for this transformation to happen. Often it begins in improbable, almost imperceptible episodes. A philosophy professor recounted how she decided to leave an abusive marriage after hearing a random phrase uttered by a child at school. "Why do you look sad even when you smile?" A simple phrase, but one that pierced the mask she had worn for years. The will to power found an opening and acted. This type of event shows that inner strength doesn't depend on grandiose circumstances. It depends on moments of lucidity when you can hear what has been trying to tell you for a long time. And when the will to power truly awakens, its action begins to reorganize the mind itself. You start to perceive patterns of behavior that you didn't see before. You begin to question habits that seemed normal. You feel a kind of healthy nonconformity, as if you finally understand that living a life that has nothing to do with you is wasting the only opportunity you have to exist fully. Nietzsche called this transvaluation, the process of reevaluating values that were previously accepted automatically, replacing them with values that make sense for your individual nature. This process isn't comfortable. On the contrary, it carries an almost chaotic energy. It's as if you were rearranging the furniture in a dark room and could only see the shapes when you bump your leg on the table. But it's precisely in this temporary chaos that important revelations emerge. You discover that many of the choices you made weren't choices but reflexes. You discover that much of what you defended was nothing more than repetition. You discover that many people who influenced you didn't represent your truth, but your insecurities. And when this clarity sets in, something fundamental changes. You can no longer go back to being who you were before. An unlikely event that illustrates this is the story of a Canadian doctor who, after years of practicing his profession, realized he was acting out of obligation and not vocation. The trigger was a casual conversation with an elderly patient who said, "You seem to take care of my body, but you are letting your soul die." The phrase paralyzed him. He resigned a month later and became a sculptor. His justification: "I discovered that I had always been an artist. I just didn't have the courage to admit it." Nietzsche wouldn't be surprised. He would say that this courage didn't arise from nothing, but from a will that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to manifest itself. When the will to power takes shape, It's not limited to internal changes. It translates into concrete decisions. You start saying no more easily. You begin to distance yourself from relationships that drain your energy. You start to see your fears not as barriers, but as tests. Each action born from this impulse creates a domino effect. A new perception generates a new choice, which generates a new perception, which generates a new kind of life. It's a self-reinforcing movement. The more you act from within yourself, the clearer it becomes who you are. And the clearer it becomes who you are, the more natural it becomes to act accordingly. What makes this process so fascinating is that it doesn't depend on anything external. You don't need to wait for the perfect moment, someone's encouragement or a group's validation. The transformation begins when you realize you are free to act, even if you feel fear. Because freedom doesn't begin when fear disappears, but when you act despite it. Nietzsche would insist on this point. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to transform fear into action. And it is precisely at this point of transition, when the will to power ceases to be merely an internal force and begins to shape real decisions, that the most decisive stage of all emerges. How to transform this newfound audacity into lasting autonomy. This is what Part 5 will explore in depth, revealing the next step in this psychological process that redefines the lives of those who understand it. At this point, it becomes impossible to ignore that the greatest conflict is not between you and the world, but between you and the version of yourself that has learned to shrink from circumstances. Many spend their lives believing they will be rewarded for being agreeable, docile, and compliant. They expect life to notice their silent effort and give something back in return. But Nietzsche dismantles this illusion like someone shining a bright light in a dark room. There is no merit in hiding. There is no destiny for those who refuse their own impulse to grow. And it is precisely at this point that the narrative becomes more intense, because each person realizes, even without admitting it aloud, that this docility is not kindness, but fear wrapped in good intentions. The whole world learns to disguise fear as humility. However, behind this tranquil appearance, there is an abyss that deepens with each choice not made. When you observe your own life honestly, you realize that many of your failures didn't stem from wrong actions, but from actions you refused to take. Lack of movement is the most common mask of modern cowardice, and Nietzsche knew this when he insisted that to live is to assert, not to wait. While some people move forcefully, acknowledging mistakes, falls, and consequences, others remain immobile, trying to avoid wounds. And what a brutal irony. It is precisely these people who end up most hurt by time, by regret, and by everything that could have been. The tension grows because the viewer begins to recognize traits of themselves in this silent stagnation. They realize that their own story is full of moments when they surrendered before even fighting, and that life, unlike comforting narratives, gives nothing to those who do not dare. This is where the narrative takes a sharp turn, because the uncomfortable question arises: what if your attempt to be accepted has always been what prevented you from being respected? This turning point is crucial because it touches on a universal wound. Everyone wants approval, but few realize that the constant search for recognition transforms us into fragile versions, easy to manipulate. Nietzsche would call this a servant spirit, a way of existing that bows down even before realizing the true weight of the situation. And when you act like this for too long, you lose your sense of self-worth. You cease to be someone who imposes presence and become someone who merely occupies space. The viewer feels the impact of this realization because they understand that it wasn't the world that took away their strength. It was they themselves who surrendered it. With each passing minute, the sense of urgency grows. Not because time is running out, but because the main character of the story, you, has begun to awaken. It's curious to note how small changes in attitude reveal truths that have been hidden for years. When you decide to face your own responsibility, everything changes tone. Excuses lose their luster, external culprits lose importance, and an uncomfortable yet liberating emptiness emerges. Nietzsche would say that it is precisely in this emptiness that the possibility of a new kind of life is born. A life in which you don't act to please but to express who you really are, in which you don't expect recognition, but build your own meaning. This point in the narrative seems like a silent preparation for something bigger, like the moment before a great revelation. But this future revelation doesn't come without risk. Every real transformation requires the symbolic death of who you were, until now. And few people have the courage to face their own grief. Grief for the docile personality, for the habit of retreating, for the fantasy that the world would be fair to those who shrink back. This is where the tension increases. You feel that something is about to collapse, and at the same time, something is about to be born. The narrative gains strength because the viewer understands that life reaches this exact point for all of us. The moment when the old identity no longer serves, but the new one has not yet been built. Nietzsche considered this interval the deepest moment of human experience, the point where the will to power finally has room to breathe. And as the viewer begins to visualize this transition, a doubt arises that accompanies them until the end of this part. Is he truly willing to abandon the version of himself that he learned to survive, to become someone who has learned to live? The answer doesn't appear yet, and that's intentional. The tension needs to be sustained until the conclusion, because only then will the final transformation have weight. Part 5 closes like a door slamming shut in the wind, letting the sound echo, preparing the ground for the definitive change that will follow. There are no guarantees, no promises, only the inevitable feeling that something profound has approached, and that, in the next stage, there will be no turning back. We've reached the point where the entire journey must become a choice. There's no going back to the old comfort zone, because now you've seen what previously went unnoticed. The strength you sought outside has always been dormant within you, waiting for the moment it would be called upon to awaken. And this is the moment when Nietzsche ceases to be merely a distant philosophical reference and becomes a direct, almost uncomfortable mirror, reflecting what you've avoided for years. The question that once sounded theoretical now transforms into a vital demand. Who do you decide to be after understanding that life doesn't reward those who hide? There's a profound silence here, the kind of silence that precedes not an end, but a rebirth. A rebirth that doesn't arrive with fanfare but with responsibility. The first step on this path is strange and even uncomfortable, because it involves realizing that no one will come to save you. There is no external mentor, government, destiny, or deity to carry the burden of your choices on their shoulders. Nietzsche argued that taking charge of one's own destiny is the purest act of freedom, and this is where everything changes. Perhaps you were never truly weak. Perhaps you were just accustomed to the security of being led by others. But from here on, that is no longer enough. From here on, you need to lead yourself. You need to recognize that your life doesn't improve when you wait, but when you act. Even if your actions are small, imperfect, or uncertain, they are what break the cycle of voluntary servitude that has held you captive for so long. And deep down, you know it's past time to act. But taking action doesn't mean transforming everything overnight. It means starting with simple decisions, those that may seem tiny, but that change the structure of your mind. You decide what you tolerate, what you consume, what you repeat. You decide which conversations you nurture, which people maintain access to your energy, which habits reinforce your identity. The will to power doesn't arise from grand explosions, but from the consistency of taking control where there was previously automatism. Nietzsche believed that every small affirmation of autonomy strengthens character, and that every refusal of conformity brings you closer to a more authentic life. You don't need to defeat the whole world. You only need to defeat the pattern that keeps you trapped. That is the first real victory. And when you begin to experience this kind of movement, you realize something surprising. Life wasn't as heavy as it seemed. The weight came from internal resistance, from that desperate attempt to fit into expectations that were never yours. When you abandon those expectations, an unexpected, almost disconcerting lightness emerges. You finally breathe. You finally expand. You finally realize that there is a force that has always been there. It just needed space to manifest itself. Nietzsche would call this a reunion with your own being, a being that doesn't need to ask permission to exist. A being that doesn't need to justify its intensity. A being that simply lives in the fullness of who it is. This expansion doesn't distance you from the world. On the contrary, it brings you closer to it in a deeper way. When you live authentically, you stop depending on the validation of others and, paradoxically, you become someone others truly respect. You become a reference point, not because you tried to please, but because you dared to exist without masks. And that has an impact, the kind of impact that transforms environments, relationships, decisions. Nietzsche said that the world belongs to those who say yes to their own essence, and now you understand the meaning of that. Saying yes to yourself is the rarest and most powerful act anyone can perform. And when you do that, you create a rupture, an internal rupture that reorganizes everything around you. But this transformation isn't just philosophical. It needs to manifest in practice. It begins when you make small daily commitments, speaking more firmly, breaking patterns that weaken you, saying no when necessary, choosing challenges instead of comfort zones, taking calculated risks, and letting go of the need to justify every move. These are small but cumulative actions that shape a new character. And the more you practice, the more you realize that life never demanded perfection, only presence. Nietzsche believed that greatness doesn't come from the result, but from the courage to walk towards the unknown. And now that unknown is your new territory, a territory you are finally ready to explore. As you reach the end of this journey, you realize that the video wasn't just content, but a direct confrontation with the part of you that always waited for permission to exist. And if you've made it this far, that already says a lot about who you can become. Don't waste this momentum. Don't let this understanding die as soon as the video ends. Make it the spark for a life that finally reflects your true strength. The world doesn't need more people who hide. It needs individuals who embrace their own potential without fear of what they can become. It is this courage that builds meaning. It is this courage that transforms. And now I want to invite you to do something simple yet powerful. If this video moved you in any way, like it. If something inside you awakened, comment. Even if it's just an "I'm here," even if it's anonymously. And if you want to continue evolving on this journey, subscribe to the channel. Here, each video is made to provoke, uplift, and help you become everything you were meant to be. Your transformation begins with one step. This is the moment to take the next one.